our research question was, how did different monarchies affect the economies of their respective nations?
The countries that we will be discussing are France, Italy, England, and Spain. So, in the next coming slides, you will hear about all four and their different monarchies that are, interconnected in its own little ways, but each had their own style and effect on their economy. So, for my historical context, I went way back to, the Roman Empire with Augustus. He reigned from 27 BC to 14 AD, his death. So I chose this because he was one of the first monarchists of that time period, and it's really insane to see how during his time he reigned so vast, all the way from Spain and Portugal all the way to the Ottoman area side of things and that whole entire Mediterranean area. And he did it with his power and the influence that he had over his people. And looking at the statue to the right, we see him pointing, and he's pointing to the people. He's a leader, and on his breastplate actually is a bunch of gods, Greek gods, or sorry, Roman gods, that symbolize his connection with the gods, because back in the day they believed that they had divine rights, so they were chosen to rule over the people. And it's crazy how that evolved into something where we're going to look at in the future about how monarchists and leaders and kings and queens were chosen through lineage and marriage and all of that fun jazz. So that was a cool kind of comparison between old monarchies to the ones that we're about to look at.
So, Henry VIII was the King of England from 1509, roughly, to his death in 1547. And we'll go a bit more into depth with him later on when we discuss the English monarchy. But Henry was a really interesting monarch at the time. He went to war almost every decade with France, and he began reigning at 17 years old after the death of his brother. And King Henry's big claim to fame was splitting the Catholic Church and separating into his own denomination of Christianity. And this allowed him to, of course, marry and divorce 6 other wives after his first, Catherine. So.
And behead.
True, he did behead them.
Yeah. So going from Augustus from the Roman Empire, we're going to jump straight into the Italian monarchy. So just beginning with the beginning, wow, we have the power of the church. And so the church was a big deal because they basically controlled everything. They maintained their economic power through church offices and taxation of the papal states. And then throughout the Renaissance, they held strong holdings through art, architecture, and church, and they just had a tight hold on the economy because they controlled all of the, not all, well, most of the art that went through, or the commerce that went through, or, when people used to pay off their sins through atonement and money, that's how they got a lot of money with those taxes and such. And then going on to the next point, kind of connects with paintings and architecture. Italy was huge on art and their architecture. There's so many churches that were built and paintings that were commissioned. And as you can see on the right, we have Cosimo de' Medici, painted by, I'm not going to pronounce it. I don't want to pronounce it wrong for my Italian friends out there. The Medici family in general had strong power over Italy in general. They had a Medici bank that gained political power in Florence, and they remained citizens throughout the monarchs, and they were one of the top aristocratic families that reigned throughout Italy. Then moving on, they also focused on the style of living, because before the Renaissance, before the monarchies, people focused on just living and making sure that, they can provide for their family or buy necessities that they needed. But now that there's a larger split between the upper, middle, and lower class, mostly just upper and lower class, The upper class focused on their style of living and, of course, paintings because people love themselves and they want more of themselves presented to people. And then moving on to commerce and manufactured goods, that's mostly obviously trade, and that's how they got a lot of their money as well through silks, spices, and other textiles that were traded throughout Europe and as well as like the Ottomans and down there in this Asian area. That's where they got a lot of their money from because they would take it back home and trade it with people in the merchant shops at home. And then also just gonna touch on the rural citizens. So obviously not everyone in Italy was rich. So the rural class were kind of stuck at the bottom where this is how they lived. They had poor resources. They suffered a lot because they kind of bore all the burdens of warfare and economic reorganization when, other states and countries used to attack Italy because, it was kind of easy to do that. They were just kind of in the midst of it all. So they were also affected by the economy and how they ran their states. And then moving on to Spain, most of Spain came, like most of their wealth and successful economy came from, traveling to the New World. And I'm putting quotes over it because it's not really new. They just, imperialism, colonialization, terrible. Slavery is terrible, and they just kind of exploited that. And the silver mines over in South America and North America and everywhere in between it. So that's where they got a lot of their wealth from. And then moving on to the Spanish Reconquista, they established a lot of power through killing and fear of the Jews and Muslims that lived in Spain or honestly anywhere around that. So Spain mostly got their wealth and power through fear rather than textiles or art or honestly anything else. But now moving on.
So at the time, mercantilism and joint stock companies were two major economic developments, and they were pretty common throughout England and some of France. And mercantilism being the belief that nations should increase their exports and minimize their imports to attain power and wealth. And this sort of went along with the imperialist attitudes of England and France as they colonized many parts of Africa and the Americas. And the joint stock companies also contributed to that colonialization, as the stocks were made up of groups of shareholders, and often at the time the companies were, export focused trade companies, so they would be working with imperialists throughout the Americas and in Africa. Uh, England and France both also further developed the Atlantic trade system, trading to the Americas and to Africa. And of course, they were both heavily involved in the slave trade. And now France as well. Francis the First actually began to develop the fur trade to North America, and that sort of set up in Canada and became, as fur trappers in France became more and more popular, trading fur from France to North America became more of a lucrative economic industry. So, to summarize, a couple of major themes that we see throughout all of Europe really is their economies are now booming, and they're establishing overseas trade and merchant stops in the Americas and Africa and in Asia. And these major European powers are beginning to create and develop new industries, such as the slave trade to and from the Americas and then eventually to Africa, and trading art, international commerce, etc. Spices, silk.
Yeah, we love
all
those.
That kind of stuff.
Textiles. Yeah, and then moving on, we have mercantilism. Okay, said it right. Cool. So that's the idea that you export more than you import, which obviously brings up the idea of power and wealth, because that's literally what Spain did. Went to the New World, brought a lot of things back, and that's how they got most of their power and wealth. And that definitely continues on with the idea of colonialism and imperialism that continues on into the centuries to come. And then we see that from those monarchies that more European empires and countries bring come out of that. We see the French Revolution where they got angry and they, just we hate the government, we hate the upper class, let's make something new, let's start a revolution. We see the Holy Roman Empire kind of falling apart and coming into something new, and Germany being created and all of that's in a long time, but still out of monarchies come smaller and more refined and nationalistic countries. And lastly, we have religious unrest, which was always a thing with Catholics and Protestants, which were definitely during the Renaissance, but as well as after the Renaissance and many years after that. And whether this is related to European history or not, but we see religious unrest in Africa now because of like different Muslim denominations trying to interpret the Quran in their own ways. And overall, the European monarchies did shape the way that the world honestly looks at money and wealth and power and how they use it for the better or for the worse.